Okay, let's talk politics. Now, I know President Trump's not on the pictures, partially that's because this is an old presentation, but also because the standards only go up through the Obama administration. So that's what it is. Let's talk a little bit about politics. We are in an interesting moment right now politically. We have a political spectrum, and we call the left liberal, and we call the conservatives the right. And along that spectrum, people can be more liberal or less liberal, or more conservative or less conservative, or they can have some views that are liberal and some views that are conservative. Now, in the middle are what we'd call moderate or centrists. To be a moderate or a centrist does not mean that you are independent. It gets a little complicated, but to be an independent simply means that you have not registered for a political party. So you could be a very right-wing conservative, but not have, when you register to vote, you didn't mark off that you're a Republican. Democrats tend to be on the left, Republicans tend to be on the right. There's a lot going on here. We are in a moment right now where there are people on the left that want to be more liberal, and people on the left that want to be less liberal, and people on the right that want to be more conservative, or they're more concerned about social conservatism, or they're more concerned about economic conservatives. We talked about that a little bit in the last presentation. The point here is that when we look at historical sources, I just want you to be aware of bias, right? So there are media outlets that lean towards the left, and here are some of them, and there's media outlets that lean towards the right. And along that spectrum, some of these outlets are going to be more liberal or more conservative than others. So when you start hearing things in the news about the left and the right, make sure that you understand what they're really saying is on this spectrum of political views, all that stuff we talked about in the last presentation with conservatives, they tend to be on the right, and liberals tend to be more on the left. Liberals favor a government that has more power, that can sort of protect and provide a safety net for people. Conservatives tend to want a smaller government, tend to want to control spending, and want lower taxes, less laws that protect or what they would say is control others. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the conservative movement of the 1980s. And Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan is elected because he appealed to those conservatives that were concerned about the 1970s. They had concerns over economics, so Reagan promised to fix the economy. And they were concerned about the social changes. Remember the stuff that we saw with the 1960s Warren Court, who were upset over Roe. The conservatives were upset over Roe versus Wade. Conservatives were upset about the sexual revolution and the growth of the women's movement. So they were upset about the potential harm to family values. And they were also concerned about what they saw as international embarrassments, right? The growth of communism in some areas. The Iranian hostage crisis was a real big embarrassment, and they saw the United States as weak in foreign policy. So you have this three-legged stool. I think I referred to that last time, and I missed the foreign power one, of Ronald Reagan, economic conservatism, which we're going to talk about in a moment, social conservatism, and power in foreign affairs. Reagan's economic policy is called many different things. You're going to hear it called Reaganomics. It's also called supply-side economics. Those are the big two. In political speak, we sometimes call this trickle-down economics. His opponent in the Republican side called it voodoo economics because they didn't really know where the money came from. It's sometimes called the Reagan Revolution. Know it as supply-side economics or Reaganomics. The idea of trickle-down economics is kind of easy to understand, is that Reagan argued that if you give money to the wealthy in the form of tax cuts, you give it to businesses, you give it to the wealthy, they will go out and invest that money in businesses and would create jobs. Now, the other part of this, the way he said that by cutting taxes you can fix the economy, is that the government also has to cut spending. So you see how this ties into conservative values. If you take money away from the government, they can't do as much, which would shrink the size and the power of the federal government. So all of this kind of ties in together. So now typically, when Reagan talks about cutting taxes in the 1980s, he's talking about cutting taxes from the welfare state, right? That idea of the New Deal spending, the Great Society programs. The problem with Reagan's plan, though, was that he also promised to increase defense spending so that the United States would remain powerful in foreign affairs. So Reagan is going to deeply cut taxes. And one of the things that people don't recognize about Reagan is eventually he had to raise taxes about 7 times over his presidency. But he's known as a tax cutter. So he cuts taxes in when he enters office. He cuts spending in those social welfare programs, but he also increases defense spending. And what ends up happening is here in 1980, Reagan is elected. This is our national debt adjusted for inflation. The national debt spikes in 1980 because while he cut taxes, he also increased defense spending. So we had these really big budget deficits. Reagan also supported deregulation. Now, deregulation is when you take rules away from businesses so that they can do more things, right? The idea behind this is if you take away some of the rules and regulations over business, they can be more innovative. They can do a little bit more to take risks. And if they take risks that pay off, that then helps with the economy because it grows the economy. So part of this economic conservatism of the 1980s is deregulation. So you're cutting taxes, you're deregulating, and cutting spending. And it does sort of act as like the sugar rush to the economy, but there are some things in the 1980s which, and then later, which become problematic because of deregulation. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission scandal of the late 80s happened largely because it was the SEC was taking some power away, and the stock market they could do some of these deregulated things. So let's talk about the Cold War and foreign affairs. Now, the Cold War is going to end in the Bush administration, which occurs right after the Reagan presidency. And Ronald Reagan is going to be given credit for most of the end of the Cold War by conservatives. He's a Republican. He's a conservative. Republicans want to give Ronald Reagan all the credit. They talk about Reagan's tough talk, his rhetoric against the Soviet Union. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. He comes up with all these plans against it. He also blows up the arms race, right? He increases the spending on American military weapons, nuclear weapons, and so forth, arguing that the American economy could handle the increased spending, whereas the Soviet command economy could not. So conservatives are going to talk about Reagan's rhetoric and his increased spending on the arms race as the reason for the Soviet collapse, basically saying that the Soviet economy couldn't keep up with military spending and make consumer products at the same time, which causes problems in the economy, which eventually led to uprisings in the Soviet Union. Now, liberals tend to give Reagan some credit. All that stuff is true. But they also argued that the Soviet Union was going through issues that were of its own making. A new guy was placed in charge. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. He's made the Soviet premier, which is kind of their president. Gorbachev was seen as sort of a young liberal in the Soviet Union. He looked at some of the problems that the Soviet Union had been having throughout the 70s. They had been mired in a war in Afghanistan, which was kind of their Vietnam quagmire. So he wanted to sort of relieve the pressure that he saw was rising up from underneath, and he implemented a policy called glasnost, which you see here, glasnost, which allowed some openness and some free speech in society. This allowed criticism of the Soviet government, which had been unheard of. He also eventually opened up some free market principles, essentially admitting that the command communist system didn't really work. This is called perestroika. These policies, once the floodgates were opened, they couldn't close them again. So liberals and a lot of historians are going to look at this and say, yes, Reagan did deserve some credit for ending the Cold War, but it's also Glasnost and Perestroika, these Soviet things that were implemented by Mikhail Gorbachev that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union falls, they take down the Berlin Wall in 1989, which is a year after Reagan is out of office during the George Bush administration, the first George Bush, H.W. Bush. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and symbolically, the Cold War is over. And let's skip that video. And the United States is left as the only superpower in 1991, a couple of years later, when the communist Soviet Union collapses in on itself. Russia, which had been the biggest state in the Soviet Union, is now its own independent state again, and all of those satellite buffer states are independent again. So the United States is left as the only superpower in the 1990s into the 2000s. And what the United States did was take on the role of global peacekeeper. There's a lot of regional conflicts. We can see genocide around the world. We can see issues around the world. And the United States wants to step into this role of police officer. And we can see this going back to the Teddy Roosevelt administration, that when the United States starts to act like peacekeeper, it does lead to resentment in those areas where we get involved. One area was the Middle East. Why? Because of oil, of course. But also because in Iraq there was a person named Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein invaded the country of Kuwait, which is just off its southern border. Kuwait is a very small country, but it's full of oil. The United States participated in a United Nations effort to defend the Saudi Arabians from an invasion in Iraq, partially because Saudi Arabia was an ally, because they have a lot of oil. And eventually that Persian Gulf War, which started off being called Operation Desert Shield, because if you look here, we were protecting Saudi Arabia from Iraq. Here's Kuwait right here. Became Desert Storm, and we swooped into Kuwait, liberated Kuwait, and then invaded Iraq. So this Persian Gulf War in the 1990, we liberated Kuwait. We did not get rid of Saddam Hussein, arguing that would lead to a power vacuum. And in that power vacuum, anything could happen, and somebody even worse might come along. So we protected Saudi Arabia, liberated Kuwait, and then we left. The region is also important because of religious fanatics, mostly Islamic religious fanatics, and they had organizations like the Taliban, which is in Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda, which is not a government. It's an organization that is across country lines. And throughout the 80s and 90s, they led a number of terrorist attacks. Famously, they attacked the World Trade Center in the late 80s, early 90s. And then eventually they had their most successful attack in 2001 with the September 11th or 9/11 attacks.